The Spin-off Podcast Network.
If I give them time and space, they'll find something to do, and it will always be educational.
What if a classroom could be a dahlia farm, a converted bus, a forest, or a lounge? Meet 6 families across New Zealand as they contend with the challenges and joys of education outside the bounds of a traditional classroom.
You're being taught by the people who love you.
Watch Home Education on the Spin-off today, made with the support of NZ On Air. Does your brand have something important to say through meaningful messaging that reaches the right audience? At The Spin-off, we work closely with our partners to create bespoke campaigns that bring value to both your brand and our audience. If you're interested in learning more about partnering with us, email Beck, that's BEC, at thespinoff.co.nz.
When the Facts Change is brought to you by the Spin-off Podcast Network, in partnership with KiwiBank, the bank for Kiwi looking to get ahead in business and in life. A bank that delivers expertise in banking know-how, smart advice for business owners wanting to invest, grow their business or diversify. A bank that adapts with technology through the lens of its people and customers. It is a bank with heart that is driven by its purpose. Kiwi, making Kiwi better off. Here's a tough question for you, and probably quite strange. How much would you be prepared to pay to effectively consume or enjoy making someone else miserable? And at the same time, costing yourself lots of money in spending on healthcare and education and various other publicly funded things. How much would you be prepared to consume someone else's punishment? That's the question we look at this week on When the Facts Change, in a chat I had with Professor Tracey McIntosh, who is a Professor of Indigenous Studies at the University of Auckland and looks closely at our prison system, how it works, how it doesn't work, and the societal backing for it. She makes the point, it's a really interesting one too from an economic point of view, that our prison system is essentially a place for society to consume punishment. Because, in essence, our prisons don't actually work to reduce the amount of crime or to make us safer. They essentially are there to punish and to impose a cost on those who have committed a crime. And it turns out, when you look at the total costs, of around about $2 billion, and those are the short-term, obviously identifiable costs, not the long-term and wider costs to whānau, the wider society, public health care, public education, not to mention the lost production that comes from lower productivity from all of this well-being pain. When you look at the real cost, it must be in multiples of that $2 billion a year of our correction system. Then add on to that the justice system, the police system, and it comes up to a number you'd have to say is closer to $10 to $12 billion in my view. In our discussion with Tracey on this week's When the Facts Change, we look at why that number is so large, why it indicates a failure, as Bill English might have described it, a moral and fiscal failure of our prison system. And we look more widely at the economics and the social cost of prisons and the way they operate in Aotearoa. Because in the end, the cost of that system is a type of consumer good. It's the rest of society effectively paying money to punish other people. And it's a weird sort of consumer good. It would be rare for people to pay money to see other people in pain, but that's effectively what we do. Just imagine getting a bill, an invoice from the government that said, we want you to pay $5,000 because of the enjoyment, the consumption of the effects of our prison system. Prison as a consumer good, or more importantly, prison as a consumer service. That's this week on When the Facts Change. Kia ora, and welcome into the When the Facts Change studio to Tracey McIntosh, who is a professor in indigenous studies at the University of Auckland. Tracey, lovely to have you on the show.
Kia ora, Bernard.
Now, I'm fascinated by our major problems in our political economy, including poverty. And we're going to be going to a conference about poverty and, in particular, the idea that there are systemic causes of poverty and ways to improve things. And you're going to be speaking in a section around poverty and prisons. One idea you have that I hadn't heard before is that prisons are a place where there is consumption, i.e. consumption of prisons, if you like. Can you give us an idea of what you're talking about there?
I see this consumption as happening at the societal level. So, if we think about prisons and think about the role that prisons play in society, one of the things that we can say about them is that they are, one of the strongest, most powerful, most manifest expressions of power of the state. And so I think that's really important in thinking about prisons in this way. Now, in New Zealand, we've always had a high incarceration rate, virtually from time of settlement. In fact, it was commented, very, very early on around, our incarceration rate or, the sort of, nearly a way of thinking, an incredibly strong sort of drive to punish.
Why do you think that is?
Some people have talked about it, around, this toxicity and expressing around it. In many ways, we were far more open with a whole range of other norms that we had, far more relaxed in terms of social relations. We're able to sort of, I wouldn't say transcend social class or anything like that, but there was far more flexibility around that sort of element. But this thing around punishment is important. And so when I first started to really look at this area, I used to talk about, that New Zealand has a high tolerance for incarceration. But I went on to say, and actually it's more than a tolerance for incarceration. It has sort of an enthusiasm for it. John Pratt, sort of esteemed criminologist, has talked about that from that earliest times. And later on, I've sort of really started to think about punishment, drawing on the work of Kim Workman and others, that really what we're seeing is the consumption of punishment, that we have both a performative element and we consume it. It's really a part nearly of our psyche. And we have seen times when we've seen the prison rates drop and we've seen them go up. But overall, even at times when we've seen significant decline in crime rates, say over the 30-year period starting in the 1980s, where we did see sort of a decline right across the board. During that same period of time, we sort of nearly tripled our incarceration rate. We know that that incarceration rates can go down. We had it at sort of its highest point at around 2018. We saw a decline largely through a whole range of reasons that we may or may not talk about. We'll certainly talk about them at the conference. And we are now sort of seeing that beginning of the incline again as well. So it is very receptive to political, to judicial actions, to different policing actions. But this idea that crime rates and incarceration rates are really closely tied, there's actually very little evidence, in fact, no evidence of that.
So I'm trying to get an idea of why it is people feel satisfied or want to hear that other people are in prison, that somehow this is a good thing for us all, when even the likes of Bill English has described our quite high incarceration rates, certainly relative to our crime rates, as a moral and fiscal failure. This is not a cheap piece of consumption, is it?
It's a very expensive piece of consumption, and we'll spend $1.2 billion every year around incarceration and around the corrections system. And one of the things that I find really interesting, and this is why I talk about this consumption, but also this sort of enthusiasm. If, for example, that we need to put more money into prisons because come August, we're starting to run out, there's big budget deficits. Money always goes into corrections. And yet we have no real sense that we'll get better outcomes. So if we put more money into health, If we put more money into education, at a societal level, we have a high expectation that we will get better outcomes. You put more and more money into corrections, there is very little from conservative, from progressive groups, from those who are pro-prison and those who are, abolitionists like myself. There's very little expectation that you'll get better societal outcomes, and yet we're still willing to do it. So I often have this sort of thing when I look at how much we spend on treaty settlements, for example, where we're hoping that those settlements both are, there's some form of compensation, there's some form of thinking about the restoration of the mana of a people. You think about what those are, around $270 million, and an expectation from the Crown that these are full and final, and yet every year we'll spend $1 billion on corrections.
The economist in me is thinking, how do we make this a user-pays system? And when I say user, I'm talking about the consumer. That is, all the people outside of prison who are getting some pleasure or enjoyment.
Well, I think they are paying. Vernon. That's the issue. And I think possibly it's not around enjoyment, but people, sort of feel that, this is a just society. People hope that this will make them safer. And that's where I think that intergenerational harm is not accounted for. So I think we're all paying for it. I think all of us pay for prisons. Some people are perhaps much more willing to pay than others. Others may be doing it much more reluctantly. But in terms of societal outcomes, in terms of the ability to flourish as a people, anything for me that, particularly, when I think about prisons, people often think about adults, I think about children. And so anything that narrows the trajectory of a child in terms of their ability to flourish, their ability to participate, their ability to fully engage, that comes at great societal cost.
Yes, I'm curious about this. These wider costs to society, not just today, but in the long run, from the heavy use of prisons, the intergenerational effects. Can you give us a sense of what the estimates are for, let's say, for example, putting someone in prison and what the long-term costs in a multi-generational way are?
I mean, we always have this sort of thing, that it costs to keep someone incarcerated a year, and there are gender differences between $90,000 and $120,000 a year. I actually wonder about those figures because they've been incredibly stable over a long period of time where we've seen such huge costs otherwise. But so even thinking about this, and this is where, some people talk about justice reinvestment. What would happen if you thought about the way that you could reinvest that money into communities to ensure that there is far greater levels of community well-being? So, if we're thinking about those average costs, they're very significant, but the broader costs over long periods of time are so significant. And again, I've got a real focus. I've always had, a strong focus, I guess, around tamariki and particularly around child poverty. If we think about the trajectories, if today we've got 8,000 or 9,000 people in prison, many of those will be parents. Many of those children will, from the day of arrest right through, will have the impact of what it's like to have whānau in prisons. We often talk about the tipping point, and you'll be very familiar with this. And the tipping point, you're sort of thinking about the tipping point in terms of mass incarceration is where the impact of incarceration is felt far more strongly outside of the prison than within the prison walls. And so when I think about mass incarceration and New Zealand, it's that particular thinking about where the actual impact of a prison is felt far more from the community that people are taken from than it is actually even felt within the prison. There's this sort of the carceral it goes well beyond the prison.
I'm curious too to understand which communities are hit the hardest and what are the types of damage that is done through the generations in terms of health, in terms of education, in terms of productivity, if you wanted to put an economic lens on it.
I mean, we know, and the gross disproportionality within our prison in terms of Māori, and so the impact is very much from communities. But if we look at prisons globally, what are prisons full of? Until very recently, They were largely really young populations. The longer you get sentences, you actually start to get an ageing within your prison system, and we're certainly seeing that in the US. And we do see that here. You know, again, the sort of notion around, again, John Pratt talks about this ethnic toxicity. So you have concentrations, disproportionate concentrations here, overwhelmingly, that gross disproportionality of Māori, and that people are poor. You know, so I've I teach within a university and I also teach within prisons. And the thing that's so noticeable within those prison environments when I'm teaching in those is just how homogenous my student population in prison is. So if I think about, the great diversity of my students within the university setting, incredibly diverse, but within a prison, incredibly homogenous. And the vast majority coming out of environments of great scarcity, deprivation, and high levels of surveillance.
When the Facts Change is brought to you in partnership with KiwiBank to help you understand the issues affecting the economy. And that's what their team of experts is here to do too. Here's KiwiBank economist Sabrina Delgado on what's happening with the labour market in Aotearoa.
Our slowing economy gives way to higher unemployment, and we're seeing tightness in the labour market quickly abating. Both a recovery on the supply side, with our surging migration boosting labour supply and loosening some very tight labour market conditions. But now a stronger narrative is coming through. As consumer demand cools, so too is the demand for labour. Firms are no longer hiring with the same gusto. Already, unemployment has started to lift from record lows, and we expect that to continue throughout 2024.
Visit kiwibank.co.nz to stay up to date with detailed economic analysis and forecasts from Sabrina and other KiwiBank experts. They take big issues from both here and overseas and make them relevant to Kiwi businesses.
Talofa lava. I'm Madeline Chapman, editor at The Spinoff. If you have the means, consider supporting our high-quality journalism by becoming a Spinoff member. Sign up now at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
Kia ora, I'm Duncan Grieve, founder of The Spinoff. You can help us keep all of The Spinoff's award-winning journalism free for everybody by becoming a member today at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
Tracey, one thing I was curious about was how the prison population has risen so much in recent years and how many people in prison aren't actually there being punished for a crime they've been convicted of, but are there for other reasons. Could you tell us about that?
Well, we've got a really significant increase in our remand prison population, and in many ways, this speaks to legislative changes, judicial decision-making, all sorts of elements. So we have a really high level. Now, one of the big things about if you and I were arrested today, and very much we have to be aware, depending on what we'd been arrested for, but our ability to be bailed to a home address would be far higher than many people. So the fact of the address becomes really significant in terms of bail applications. Now, there are other things in play, and I recognise those, particularly in terms of the nature of the offending. But, we will have cases, and we've had cases really recently where people, for example, who are in court, and in trial for murder, who have not been bailed, whereas sort of unthinkable with so many others. So we've got this very, very significant increase in bail. And the Bail Amendment Act has been a contributor to this ever-expanding remand population. But poverty and its impacts is a huge contributor to increasing remand populations. And again, if we look at that gross disproportionality, if we look at women, for example, and their remand population, well over 70% of women who are remand. And remember, these are people who are accused but have not been, they're not convicted and they've not been sentenced, so they're accused. Well over 70% of the population in women's prison is made up of wahine Māori.
And looking at the long-term implications of that, is there a higher rate of re-incarceration, intergenerational issues for people who are in remand?
Any encounter in the prison has an impact. And I remember, quite a lot of years ago, actually, one of my students did, I think, an important piece of work for a master's thesis, just looking at the impact of even very short periods of incarceration, periods of up to a month. The issue around incarceration, it has impacts immediately. You're unable to continue working, for example, if you're incarcerated. You can't do the caring of children when you're incarcerated. Other types of things, and again, very gendered. If men go into prison, there's often women looking after their effects. There are often women staying in the home, looking for ways to be able to pay rent. When women are incarcerated, and so remanded, there's no one looking after their things. They can't pay their rental. They become homeless while they're sort of in the care of the state. So you've got all of these sorts of impacts that happen immediately. Employment prospects are looked down. Going overseas elements can go down. Spending any time in prison. As someone who's spent a lot of time there looking at, working with people who have very long prison sentences, I'm very aware of the impacts for those people who have very long prison sentences, but also very aware of those that have shorter prison sentence. We have a very high recidivism rate in New Zealand, that is people who return to prison having been in prison. Very high recidivism rate. And the recidivism rate, of course, is highest among those who have short prison sentences. It's sort of this counterintuitive effect that those that sort of churn through the prison system are those who are doing largely relatively small lags inside, but incredibly high churn. And over time, of course, their prison sentences will often get longer during that period. So the impacts of staying in prison any period of time is hard. There's, I always say that when you're in the remand sections of prison, they're the most chaotic part of the system. You've got people who have been literally arrested sometimes, the day before. You've got people who I would call new risk, in other words, new experience, have never been in a prison before, and they're also with people who are very familiar with a prison environment in there at the same time. As I said, they're accused, they're not convicted, they're not sentenced. Often they don't have the same sort of access to programs to help, to counselling. Many of them are coming into prison with significant addictions and other elements. Often they're very traumatised because of the events that have led to them coming to prison. So remand is a chaotic space. It's, I feel, one of the hardest places within the prison. And so the impact, all of those impacts, the level of worry and anxiety about why you're in there, as I said, the trauma of perhaps being in there, but also the impact on others of you being in there. It's very, very key during that time of remand.
Now, one of the things I'm interested in is the problem of housing and how it seems to filter out and leverage out into the rest of society, into health, into education. What's the relationship been between increasingly unaffordable housing, and the growing use of private rentals, the relatively small size of our social housing stock, in making the prison system bigger, and how does it interact?
I think it's a really it was sort of interesting, there was a period and this is looking at a global example, again looking at California, where, in a period in the 80s and the 90s, I think a third of all new construction was prison construction in the state. And so there is something that when you sort of think about the huge costs of prisons, the material costs, the social costs, the health costs, the education costs, but also the fact that there is I've often thought about it being a social indictment that for some people, particularly those that are in the self-care units within a prison, that's often the best housing they've ever had. And what an indictment it is in society that the way that you can find safe housing, certainly not affordable, I wouldn't go that far, it's not affordable. Our system, our carceral system is very expensive, but that's the best house that you've been in. So I think, these Alice Mills, who's in criminology at the University of Auckland, has looked really closely at housing and prisons and people coming out of prison and the role that housing plays within that. So insecure housing is one of the most common characteristics of people who are imprisoned. And so, prior to coming into prison, insecure housing is a real feature. I've worked with a lot of very young people who come into prison, and a thing I used to do years ago was sort of have a map of the country where people would say, and they'd just show me, where they'd lived across the country. And actually this was actually me supporting them with NCEA. But it was a very telling sort of exercise for me to see, one, just how much people moved, and largely because of this housing insecurity. People were just moving all of the time, sometimes across areas, and many of them had been in fact, the vast majority had been in state care, and so had been moved from foster home to foster home, from different group homes, all sorts of elements right across the country, but had never really been in place. And one of the things, particularly for Māori, that the dispossession in a former century has huge impacts today. And so that we can see that these forms of, what I would call colonial violence, structural violence, legislative violence from one period has huge impacts going forward.
Now, just finally, looking at potential solutions, in the context of a government which is planning to cut the size of government by a full 4 percentage points of GDP in a process the Treasury described as the most aggressive tightening of fiscal policy in our history, even more so than the early 1990s. The government's, sometimes looking at things as, well, do we need to do that at all? Can't we just stop doing it? And they've certainly done that with a bunch of things. Hospitals are now no longer going to be built. Large infrastructure projects have been put off indefinitely. The government has, stopped subsidising first home buyers. There have been massive, abrupt changes in policy because the government's keen to save money. What would be a way for the government, taxpayers, to save an awful lot of money very fast in our prison system in a way that would actually save more money and improve well-being more broadly over the long term? Because there's a temptation here to think, do we really need to have all of those people in prison right now? Could we actually be better off if they weren't there?
Well, I'm a prison abolitionist, so I've got a really strong view on that, but it's a long-term view as well. So I think there's a real recognition that it is, you're not going to build a hospital, but you're going to build a prison. What does that say about us as a society? Where are we really willing to invest for the well-being, at the community level? So if we looked at a whole range of different things, and I don't think there are cheap solutions to really embedded long-term social issues. So I don't think there is the quick save, but there, in terms of societal savings, I think that they are huge. Now, one of the things is people on really short sentences. It's sort of, when you sort of see people going on 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months, it's a very expensive way. And what it sort of shows is the systemic failure elsewhere to actually be able to do things within communities. I think for me, and as a Māori woman, as a tūhoi, I believe it is one of the spaces where the state can cede power, and that we can see really truly forms of justice reinvestment back into communities, to Māori, both at iwi level, but also just at much more community level. I'm very interested in the role that hapu can play in these spaces where, the thing of incarcerating people and then releasing them and then just incarcerating them again, does speak to this thing that I often talk about fully funded failure. So, the system that we've got at the moment is fully funded failure. So we need to really think about the way that, when we think about that spend, and it's so huge, such a significant spend in this space. And, I'm not going to minimise the real harm that's done out there, that if we're going to actually have the sorts of solutions that we're going to do, they're going to have to be invested in the community. If you look at something, for example, So we can't release dangerous criminals. If we think about sexual violence, for example, we might have a prison population at the moment, over 8,000 people. If we actually incarcerated all perpetrators of sexual violence, we'd probably need a prison of about 300,000 people. So what that tells us, that absolutely sobering and terrible statistic, that the work must be done at the community level. We must be able to create the change there. It does mean a complete reinvestment of those elements. But young people, should we be putting in there? What are we doing with, we've got mother and baby units within prisons. Why wouldn't we be doing the support outside in the community? Why would we incarcerate children? So I think that there's a lot to be done. I don't think there's anything about a cheap or quick fix. I do think that there is something about looking at the formulas where we can think we won't build a hospital up to the standards necessary for a whole region, but we will consider significant extensions to prisons. We have to think about the way that who are behind those formulas.
Tracey McIntosh, a Professor of Indigenous Studies at the University of Auckland. Tracey, thank you so much for being on When the Facts Change.
Kia ora, Bernard.
When the Facts Change was brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network, together with KiwiBank. Visit kiwibank.co.nz to find out how KiwiBank are making Kiwi better off.
Are you curious about how business can be better? I'm Simon Pound, and I host Business is Boring, a podcast where I kōrero with some of the most interesting people in entrepreneurship, commerce, and making things happen. Tune in to Business is Boring every Tuesday, brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network in partnership with Spark Business Lab.
Kia ora e te iwi, Te Aihe Butler here, podcast manager at the Spin-Off. If you enjoy listening to our podcasts, consider supporting our mahi by signing up to become a Spin-Off member at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
The Spin-Off Podcast Network.